greatest poems weren't born in the head, but in the heart. We're about to dive into how one man, William Wordsworth, completely tore up the poetry rulebook by arguing exactly that. And in the process, he basically changed literature forever.
I mean, just think about that for a second. What if the whole point of a poem wasn't to show off a big vocabulary or sound super clever, but to just capture one powerful, universal human feeling? That's the exact question Wordsworth threw out there, and it became the foundation for, well, the entire Romantic movement.
Now, to really get how huge this was, we gotta look at what he was up against. See, before Wordsworth, poetry played by a very, very different set of rules.
So back in the 18th century, classicism was king. Poetry was all about intellect, reason, and control. It was super formal, kind of detached, and really focused on city life. And then Wordsworth and the Romantics come along and just flip the script. They said, forget intellect, let's talk about imagination. Forget rules, let's talk about freedom. And they found their inspiration in nature and the lives of everyday rural people. All of a sudden, poetry got deeply personal.
So, okay, out with the old rules. But now Wordsworth needed a brand new definition for what poetry even is. And his answer? Well, it became one of the most famous phrases in all of English literature. Let's just sit with that for a moment. It's not one thing, it's a two-part process. First, you've got that spontaneous overflow, that raw, intense, in-the-moment feeling. But, and this is the key, the poem isn't written right then and there. It's actually born much later when the poet thinks back on that feeling in a calm, quiet moment.
This whole idea really demystifies the creative process, you know? He breaks it down into simple steps. First, you go out and you live, you experience something powerful. Then, later, you find a quiet space to reflect on it. And that final step, that's where the magic happens. The art is created not from the raw emotion itself, but from the memory of that emotion.
And Wordsworth totally practiced what he preached. Think about his famous poem, Daffodils. He didn't write it while standing in that field of flowers. No way! He wrote it later, just lying on his couch. The memory of the daffodils flashes upon that inward eye, and boom, he re-experiences that joy. That feeling relived right there, that's the poem. Okay, so we know what poetry is, but what about the poet? Is this person some kind of genius, totally separate from the rest of us normal folks? Wordsworth's answer was a hard no.
This line right here, it's so simple, but it's such a powerful statement. He's knocking the poet right off the pedestal. A poet isn't some mystical oracle. A poet is a human being, just like you and me, living in the same world, feeling the same things.
Now, here's the crucial distinction. The poet isn't a different kind of person. They just have the volume turned up. They have, as Wordsworth said, a more lively sensibility. They just feel things a little more intensely, they have a bit more empathy, and they have what he calls a more comprehensive soul, which basically means they can tap into the joys and sorrows that connect all of us.
And this brings us to a really subtle point that's actually a huge deal. Have you ever noticed the wording he uses in his famous essay? He doesn't ask who a poet is, he asks what a poet is. Why on earth does that little word matter so much?
Because by asking what, he totally shifts the conversation. It's no longer about status or identity or who gets to join the cool poets club. It's about the purpose of poetry. What is its job? And for Wordsworth, the job of poetry is to be a voice for our shared human experience. It was a massive strike against elitism. So this idea of being democratic, of tearing down walls, leads directly to his third and maybe his most radical idea. If poetry is about common feelings, and the poet is a common person, then what kind of language should poetry use? Wordsworth went to war with something he called poetic diction. You know what I'm talking about. That super fancy, elaborate, and totally artificial language that older poets used. It was full of frills and sounded absolutely nothing like how real people talked. He saw it as just a barrier between the emotion of the poem and the person reading it.
So what was his solution? It was simple and it was revolutionary. Write poems using the real, actual words of everyday people. He was especially drawn to people living in the countryside because he felt they were closer to nature and spoke a more honest, emotionally pure language.
And again, you see the theme, right? This was all about making poetry relatable, making it feel true. He wanted anybody, not just some highly educated elite class, to be able to pick up a poem and feel its power in their gut.
So when you put all these ideas together, a new definition for poetry, a new vision for the poet, and a whole new language, it adds up to nothing less than a full-on revolution.
And this is his legacy. Right here, he put emotion over intellect. He made nature a primary source of inspiration. He took the poet off the pedestal and made them a deeply empathetic human. And he did it all using everyday language, which told all of us that our own individual experiences were valid and worthy of art. But what's so critical to understand is that this was bigger than just poetry. It was part of this massive cultural shift where Western society really started to value our inner world, our feelings, our memories, our personal connection to the world around us. And honestly, it's a shift we are still feeling every single day.
So, I guess that leaves us with this one big, powerful question at the very heart of Wordsworth's revolution. What if the most important truths in life aren't hiding in some complex philosophy book, but are right here, inside of us, in the simple, powerful feelings that connect us all?